And from the latter, that would be monkeys, at a remote period, man, the wonder and glory of the universe, proceeded from the monkeys. Yeah. Now, a fellow that was a contemporary of Charles Darwin, who was writing and doing his work right about the time of the publication of Origin of Species. In fact, this drawing was made between the Origin of Species and Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, in 1867. Some of you may have heard of Ernst Haeckel. He's widely considered to have been essentially a charlatan, not a real scientist. But he did much to popularize evolution. In fact, this is one of the first attempts to deal with the so-called specifics of evolution, starting with a single cell, going through all these stages on up to this gentleman here. I got this out of a biology textbook, and I couldn't believe what they said about this drawing by Haeckel, who, by the way, if you're familiar with his work on recapitulation, he actually falsified the data, used the same woodcut more than once to show how similar pigs and humans are and what have you as an embryo. In the book, look what they say. This is a biology textbook. Although this genealogical chart, starting with a blob of protoplasm up here, and continuing to a modern Papua, that's the gentleman down here, although this is filled with misconceptions and fictitious creatures, it's fairly accurate. Am I missing something here? I mean, apparently it didn't go by you either. I mean, fairly accurate, let's give him his due, fairly accurate considering the dearth of knowledge in his day. In other words, how little we knew then. And of course, things have not changed greatly to this day, as you will see. There are really four primary assumptions, starting assumptions, that impact on our interpretation of the fossil record as it relates to the origin of man. First, all origins must be explained in strictly naturalistic terms. That is, in terms of human evolution, one must not in any way, shape, or form, directly or indirectly, bring in a supernatural event, a god, etc. So we must confine all explanations to strictly naturalistic terms. And this isn't just simply a rule of the game. Another part of this is we must exclude the possibility of anything ever being non-naturalistic. So it's not like we're just limiting our own explanations, but there can be no other explanation. Here's the second little rule. Similarity proves evolutionary ancestry. That there can't be any other basis for similarity, which we sometimes call homology, than that we share a common evolutionary ancestor. The third axiom is that man has evolved from ape-like ancestors. This is not a point that's debated or questioned by evolutionists. And finally, at least some ape-like fossils that we find as we dig around must be our ancestors. Why? Because, well, as one evolutionist said, if they're not, we wouldn't have any ancestors. So at least some of the fossils we dig up just have to be our evolutionary ancestors. But not all evolutionists are equally confident about our results thus far. Richard Lewontin is a professor at Harvard University. He's a self-professed atheist and Marxist and certainly an evolutionist. He said, and I quote, in Human Diversity, he said, despite the excited and optimistic claims that have been made by some paleontologists, no fossil hominid species can be established as our direct ancestor. And you know, when you look at the tables, you certainly get that impression. Here's a typical diagram of human evolution starting with insectivores down here. And notice all the question marks in there. At every branch you see question marks, or they ought to be there if not shown, because most of these charts do show dotted lines and question marks, indicating that these are speculations. And if we take this last step from an Australopithecine to man, it's supposed to have occurred over the last 5 million years, give or take a week or two, one way or another. Here is the common ancestor of modern apes and modern man. Now, sometimes you'll hear creationists say, if man evolved from apes, how come we still have apes? That's really not a good point to make, because evolutionists would point out that African apes didn't evolve into man. So you wouldn't expect their numbers to be diminished because man is evolving. that rather modern apes and modern humans share a common ancestor 5 million years ago, and of course that common ancestor is a much debated point. I haven't even chosen to take a stab here. These dotted lines are fairly typical of what you see in these charts, and they oftentimes include the question marks. In case you don't realize, dotted lines means conjecture or speculation. So what we can see is if you were to take that all away, it just simply means this organism lived from here to here virtually unchanged. This one lived from here to here unchanged, here to here unchanged. One thing I find interesting in these diagrams is notice the ancestors leading up to man. Now notice the ancestors from our common ancestor leading up to African apes. It's as though we've told the African apes, if you're interested in your evolution, figure it out for yourself. We're working on humans. Now, all of the creatures you see here are Australopithecines. That's what the A stands for. And Australopithecus is a word that simply means, take it apart, Australo means like in Australian, it means south. My friend Ken Ham from Australia says he's from the deep south. And Pithecus, wherever you see the word Pithecus, Pithecus means ape. So if any creature has Pithecus in the name, whatever else we can say about it, it is an ape. So these are all Australopithecines indicated here up until you get to Homo. This is Ramitis and Anamensis and Afarensis and Africanus used to be an ancestor of ours, but notice it's been put off in a side shoot. We call this a collateral relative. Didn't quite make it to man, made it part way and got into a side shoot or a dead end and didn't go any further. So a hominid is really any primate that is a known ancestor of man or a collateral relative, which means there would be no hominids, except perhaps man himself. Now we're going to be looking at this one right here. This is Australopithecus afarensis. This is Lucy. Lucy's the common name. Admitted, it's easier to say Lucy than Australopithecus afarensis. So oftentimes people will just use the word Lucy when they mean this whole species. Well, before we dig in any further, let's look at some sobering comments made by evolutionists. These are definitely not creationists we're talking about here. This gentleman said, even with DNA sequence data, we have no direct access to the process of evolution. So objective reconstruction